"I can't believe he's actually marrying that fat pig," my son-in-law whispered. And he said it so casually, I almost thought I had imagined it. The words floated across the soft music and clinking glasses of the reception hall just minutes before the ceremony, landing somewhere deep in my chest where a mother's instincts live. I was standing near the champagne table at the Rosewood Country Club, watching guests admire the white roses and golden lights Emily had spent months choosing, when I heard Jason laugh quietly with one of his groomsmen. My daughter was only 20 feet away, glowing in her lace gown, smiling nervously as her bridesmaids adjusted the veil she had dreamed about since she was a little girl. For a moment the room kept moving exactly the same. Servers carrying trays, violins playing, guests chatting about the beautiful summer weather outside. But inside me something had gone very still. Emily had struggled for years to believe she was beautiful. I knew every tear she had cried in high school mirrors, every diet she had tried, every small victory when she finally began to love herself. And now the man who was about to promise a lifetime beside her had reduced her to a cruel joke. I didn't confront him. I didn't gasp. I simply lifted my glass, watched him across the room, and realized this wedding was about to become something none of those smiling guests would ever forget. The music continued to play as if nothing had happened, a gentle violin melody drifting through the ballroom, while guests admired the tall white centerpieces and the soft golden lights hanging from the ceiling. From the outside, everything looked perfect, the kind of wedding people would talk about for years, the kind you see in glossy magazines with smiling families and flawless photographs. Emily had planned every detail herself during the past 8 months, often calling me late at night to ask whether the table linens should be ivory or champagne, whether the cake should have 3 tiers or 4, whether the roses should be blush or pure white. I remembered sitting at my kitchen table with her just 3 weeks earlier, measuring ribbon samples with a small ruler and laughing about how serious weddings suddenly make people. She had looked so happy that night, her eyes bright, her voice full of excitement about the life she believed she was about to begin. Watching her now from across the room, carefully smoothing the front of her dress while one of the bridesmaids fixed a tiny curl near her ear, I could still see the little girl she used to be. Emily had never been the loudest or most confident child. In middle school, she used to hide behind oversized sweaters and avoid school photos because she believed she was not pretty enough. I had spent years reminding her that kindness and strength mattered far more than any number on a clothing tag. Over time, she began to believe it. She went to college, built a career, and slowly grew into a woman who carried herself with quiet confidence. That was why hearing Jason's careless laughter just minutes earlier felt like something cold had been poured into the center of my chest. The man who was about to stand beside her at the altar was supposed to be the one person who would protect that confidence, not quietly chip away at it when he thought nobody important was listening. I kept my eyes on Jason across the room while pretending to admire the floral arrangements on the guest tables. He stood near the bar with his groomsmen, adjusting the cuff of his jacket and smiling the confident smile that had impressed so many people when Emily first introduced him to the family. At first glance, he looked exactly like the man everyone believed he was, successful, polite, and effortlessly charming. Guests greeted him with handshakes and friendly laughter, and he responded with the same warm tone he always used in public. Yet now that I had heard those quiet words, every small movement began to look different. When Emily walked over to ask him something about the ceremony schedule, he smiled at her, but his eyes shifted quickly toward his friends, as if they shared a private joke. When she turned away, I noticed the faint roll of his shoulders, the kind of gesture someone makes when they believe nobody important is watching. It was subtle enough that most people would miss it entirely, but a mother notices things others overlook. I suddenly remembered a few moments from the past year that had once seemed harmless. A comment Jason made about Emily skipping dessert. A laugh when someone mentioned exercise. Small things, easily dismissed at the time. Standing there beneath the soft lights of the ballroom, I realized those moments might not have been harmless at all. And the more I watched him, the more certain I became that the man smiling beside my daughter was not the man she believed she was marrying. Just as I was turning away from the bar, someone gently touched my arm. It was Rachel Dawson, Emily's closest friend since college, still holding a small bouquet of pale roses from the bridal suite. Her smile looked polite, but her eyes carried a hesitation that did not belong at a wedding. For a moment she glanced toward the group of groomsmen across the room, before leaning slightly closer to me. The music and conversations around us softened her words, but the worry in her voice was unmistakable. She asked if we could speak privately for a moment, somewhere quieter. We stepped a few feet away toward a hallway near the ballroom doors where the sounds of the reception faded into a distant hum. Rachel clasped her hands together as if searching for the right words. She told me she had debated all morning about whether to say anything, because she did not want to ruin Emily's special day. But she also said that hearing Jason joking earlier with his friends had reminded her of something she had witnessed before. According to Rachel, during a dinner party months earlier, Jason had laughed with a few coworkers and made a careless remark about Emily's weight while she was in the kitchen. Rachel said she had assumed it was a foolish attempt at humor and hoped it was an isolated mistake. Standing there in the quiet hallway, hearing her repeat those words with clear discomfort, I felt the uneasy pieces of the morning beginning to fit together in a way I wished they did not. I stood there for a moment after Rachel finished speaking, watching the soft light from the ballroom spill across the polished floor, while distant laughter floated through the open doorway. Weddings are supposed to be simple moments of joy, yet suddenly every memory from the past year began replaying in my mind with unsettling clarity. I remembered a Sunday dinner at Emily's apartment when Jason casually suggested that they should start jogging together every morning because, as he said with a smile, it would be good for both of them to stay in shape. At the time, Emily had laughed and brushed it off, but I had noticed the way she quietly pushed her plate away afterward. I remembered a family barbecue last summer when Jason joked that wedding photos looked better when the bride stayed camera ready, a comment that had seemed harmless then, but now carried a different weight. Standing in that quiet hallway beside Rachel, those small moments no longer felt like innocent remarks. They felt like pieces of a pattern that had been hiding in plain sight. Rachel watched my face carefully as if worried she had said too much, but I simply thanked her for telling me the truth. Across the room, the music swelled again and guests began taking their seats for the ceremony. I took a slow breath, straightened my shoulders, and looked back toward the ballroom where Jason stood laughing with his friends. In that moment, I realized something important. If he believed nobody had heard him earlier, then he was about to make a very serious mistake. The ballroom doors opened wider as guests began finding their seats, the low murmur of conversation rising and falling like a quiet tide. A wedding coordinator moved gracefully between the rows of white chairs, adjusting ribbons and reminding everyone that the ceremony would begin in just a few minutes. From across the room, I could see Emily standing near the entrance with her bridesmaids, holding her bouquet of white roses while trying to steady her breathing the way brides always do before walking down the aisle. She looked radiant, hopeful, and completely unaware of the conversation that had shifted the entire morning for me. Jason, meanwhile, remained near the bar speaking confidently with his friends, his posture relaxed as though the day belonged entirely to him. I walked slowly toward a quiet corner near the tall windows and took my phone from my purse. For a moment, I simply held it in my hand, watching the reflection of the ballroom lights on the glass screen. A thought had begun forming in my mind, calm and deliberate. If Jason believed he could speak carelessly when he thought nobody important was listening, then perhaps he simply needed a larger audience to understand the weight of his own words. I opened the voice recording application and slipped the phone back into my purse, leaving the microphone just barely visible above the lining. Then I turned back toward the room where the groom and his friends were laughing again, and I walked calmly in their direction. The closer I moved toward the bar, the clearer their voices became. Jason was leaning back against the polished wood counter, holding a glass of sparkling water, while two of his groomsmen laughed beside him. They were speaking quietly, but not quietly enough. I stopped a few feet away, pretending to study a framed photograph of the country club hanging on the wall, while the small microphone inside my purse remained pointed toward them. One of the men joked about how nervous Jason must be before the ceremony, and Jason let out a short laugh that sounded far too confident for someone about to make lifelong vows. He shook his head and said marriage was simply the next step, the logical move that everyone expected. Then he added something that made the air around me feel colder than the ballroom's air conditioning. He said that once the wedding photos were finished and the honeymoon was over, Emily would probably start trying to change herself again because she always worried about how she looked. One of the groomsmen laughed and asked if that bothered him. Jason shrugged and replied that it did not matter very much, because appearances fade anyway, and people eventually get used to what they have. The group chuckled again, as if it were harmless humor. Inside my purse, the recording application captured every word clearly. I stood there a moment longer, listening to their laughter fade beneath the soft music, and realized that the evidence I needed had just quietly gathered itself in my hand. The ceremony music began to rise gently from the far end of the ballroom, a slow piano melody, signaling that the guests should turn their attention toward the aisle. Chairs shifted softly as people settled into their seats, and the quiet excitement that always fills a wedding ceremony spread through the room like warm sunlight. I stepped away from the bar and walked calmly toward the bridal entrance where Emily stood waiting beside her bridesmaids. She was smiling nervously, adjusting the ribbon around her bouquet while the wedding coordinator whispered final instructions. When she saw me approaching, her shoulders relaxed the way they always did when she was a little girl and needed reassurance before something important. I reached for her hand and gave it a gentle squeeze. For a moment, I simply looked at her, taking in the careful makeup, the delicate lace on her sleeves, and the hopeful expression in her eyes. Then I quietly took my phone from my purse and opened the recording I had captured only minutes earlier. I did not play it out loud. Instead, I held the screen where only she could see it and let her read the short transcript the application had generated beneath the audio file. At first, she frowned slightly, confused by what she was looking at. Then her eyes moved slowly across the words, and the hopeful brightness in her expression faded into a quiet, steady stillness that told me she understood exactly what those words meant. Emily looked at the screen for several long seconds while the soft piano music continued drifting through the ballroom. Around us, the guests had already turned toward the aisle, expecting the ceremony to begin at any moment. But for Emily, the world seemed to narrow to the small rectangle of light in her hands. I watched her breathing change slowly, the nervous excitement from a few minutes earlier fading into something calmer and far more certain. She read the transcript once, then again, her eyes moving carefully across every word Jason had spoken. When she finally lifted her gaze to meet mine, there were no tears there, only a quiet clarity that surprised even me. Without saying anything, she handed the phone back and turned toward the open ballroom doors where the officiant and the waiting guests were beginning to wonder about the delay. The music paused as she stepped forward, her white dress catching the glow of the chandeliers while every head in the room turned toward her. Jason straightened at the front of the aisle with a confident smile, clearly expecting the ceremony to begin. Emily walked halfway down the aisle before she stopped. The room fell into a deep silence that seemed to stretch across every table and chair. She looked directly at Jason for a moment, calm and steady. Then she spoke in a clear voice that carried easily through the quiet hall. She said she believed marriage should begin with respect and honesty, and today she had discovered that those promises were already missing. With that, she gently placed her bouquet on the nearest chair, turned around, and walked back toward the entrance while the entire room stood frozen in stunned silence.